the conversation that we've sort of that we're launching today or revisiting today, I guess the starting question I would ask to you is that there's often an assumption that we have things in different boxes. That on the one hand we have really tough political issues that are informed by power, quite frankly, and the need to deal with and balance power, to deter power, to check power. Often because we care about morality, but there's a set of people who I think sometimes think that these things are very divorced. And then the other issue are, human rights, ethics, morality, and the do-gooders, the Amnesty International's, Human Rights Watch, and they do that, and they kind of try to call us account. But really, the tough people in the room have to deal with power. And I sense that, I know that a lot of your thinking over the decades has been about trying to help us understand that these things aren't as separate as they might seem. But with that sort of in mind, could you tell us a little bit about your thinking on these buckets and whether they're really as distinct as they seem?
Leslie, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad you started off with this notion of family, because coming here, I actually feel in some ways coming home. Carnegie Council and Chatham House have a lot in common. Legacy institutions founded about 100 years ago to promote the same values. And so our missions are very much aligned. And it's just really great to have met you and see your work, the work that you're doing, not only with the Americas program, the Leadership Academy, Next Generation, making this legacy relevant to today and into the future is really critical. So you really brought Chatham House alive, and I really appreciate that. Also appreciate you talking about us. I do hope there are more things that Chatham House and the Carnegie family can do together, particularly along this line of ethics as it relates to international affairs. You just put it very nicely. The traditional way of thinking is that ethics is one bucket, power politics is another. And so my entire career has been based on the idea that that's a false choice, that power is always guided by some notion of ethics, or at least should be. We can discuss all of that, but that power politics and morality are two sides of the same coin. We can talk about that dynamic. I see Mick Cox is here. We've been talking about this for decades now, going back to Hans Morgenthau. Did people understand what Morgenthau was saying correctly or incorrectly? I think I'm actually right and Mearsheimer's wrong, but we can talk about that. But that I think Morgenthau had a very sophisticated understanding of the relationship between power and morality. I noticed that just a couple of academic points of reference, but a wonderful book which goes to Chatham House, Carnegie Council mission, The Internationalists, written by Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro. Wonderful book. And they talk about power needing to be, it's like rushing water. And it needs to be channeled and controlled in some way. And that's how they see this whole enterprise of international law and organization, as a normative attempt to channel power. In my sense was that Morgenthau thought the same thing, that you could talk about power, raw power, but absent some notion of particularly limits to power was to make a grave mistake, to see power for power's sake. And I did pick out one quote that I think is relevant to this, and it might be relevant to the current moment about power. Leslie and I were just talking beforehand about what distinguishes this moment right now is we have leaders who are willfully taking the power without limits idea and leading around this concept all around the world. What Morgenthau wrote in 45, 48, depending on which edition, Nick is laughing, which edition of Politics Among Nations you want to quote. It's sort of like the Bible. But this was sort of an interesting point of reference. I'll just throw it out there. Leaders refuse to consider certain ends and to use certain means, not because in the light of expediency they seem impractical or unwise, but because certain moral rules impose an absolute barrier. But there are just certain things we don't do, and we don't do them for ethical reasons. And that what Morgenthau said, the struggle for power was actually shaped by ethics, mores, and law. Right? Ethics being the conscience, mores being what's considered accepted in society, and law being what's agreed to. And that to ignore that was to make a grave mistake. So those are just some, I can go on and give the whole lecture, and I won't do that now. But I wanted to throw that out there because, again, this is a different moment, right? That was written at the end of World War II, the beginning of what is our point of reference, the post-World War II liberal world order. We've gone through a lot since then, and I'm just curious how that hits you, a group like this, such a distinguished group now.
So let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and engage you a little bit before we engage the rest of our interlocutors. We've talked about different kinds of compromises, and obviously there's a lot of things on the table in the current moment we'll get to, perhaps for over a year now. But just generally thinking with maybe some historical examples or current examples, what is a good compromise? What's a bad compromise? What kind of, if you think about, and I understand you said, they're not separate buckets, they go together, the two sides of the same coin, but still when the rubber hits the road and you're talking about peace talks or trade-offs, do you have a sense, or do you have an analytical framework or a set of examples for what you think, that was a bad compromise and it proved to be a bad compromise, or
Right.
This is a good kind of compromise to make?
Right. So I did come prepared for that question. So again, knowing all the distinguished academicians in this room, I have an academic point of reference, but then I'll talk about that. So my point of reference that I've adopted is a book, which was a series of lectures given by Avishai Margalit. In the title is On Compromises and Rotten Compromises, and how to distinguish between a compromise and a rotten compromise. And, I think it's relevant to our discussion today, engaging with authoritarians. So my own view is that you've already started. We've already decided that we're in a political realm and compromise will be necessary. And so your question is, how do you sort out the two? So Margalit uses, I'll get right to the bottom line because I really want to have a conversation, but he uses this very sort of infelicitous phrase, but it's good because it brings it all home. He distinguishes between, he says, compromises where there's a fly in the ointment versus the cockroach in the soup. Okay, the fly in the ointment means you make a decision, but you can remove it in the bigger picture. Like it's part of something bigger, comprehensive, and you're not happy with it, but you can make the case given the context of it. Versus the cockroach in the soup, it ruins the whole thing. And his book is sort of a development of sorting out some differences between those two. And just to give you one of the highlights of it is he talks about the great compromise of the United States Constitution. The compromise of slavery being, it's not in the Constitution, but it's not ruled out, right? And then we also have 3/5 and so on. And he actually says that's a bad compromise. That would be the cockroach, so the whole thing sort of ruined. But I'll let you can look into that and play on that. So the big question here is trying to sort out, how you resign yourselves to sort of second best options how you think about diplomacy. And by the way, this gets back to Morgenthau, who again talks a lot about diplomacy, and he comes up with his different rules of diplomacy, 9 rules of diplomacy. And the idea being that politics in general, particularly power politics, world politics, engaging with authoritarians, is by nature, using the nautical analogy, it's sailing upwind, and you have to make trade-offs as you try to get to your North Star or your actual goal. So that's sort of a framework to think about it, but those are just principles. I think that in order to really get to this, you need to talk about examples.
So let me give you an example.
Yeah,
that's not
great.
an example that's all in our mind, and then I'm sure we're going to turn to some really tough questions around
Great.
Russia and Ukraine. And maybe it's what is your reflection on this? North Korea, right? Those who are engaged in nuclear diplomacy on North Korea for the longest of times really didn't want to deal with the human rights question.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something that at one point I looked at quite carefully. And there was that moment when it talks with North Korea just basically went nowhere. There are all sorts of attempts made, and every strategy sort of failed. And there was a moment after the Commission of Inquiry released its report on human rights abuses in North Korea,
Mm-hmm.
when even the nuclear strategist said, actually, we'll take the human rights issue seriously now. And I remember saying to Bob Bellucci, why? And it was a purely pragmatic answer. And the answer was, we'll take the human rights question seriously now because we're not getting anywhere with North Korea, no matter what we try, from a negotiation and putting human rights in a box strategy. So therefore, we can now combine questions of morality and strategy because nothing else has worked. And logically, the extension of that was the only way to get either somewhere positive on the nuclear front or on the human rights front was regime change. So there was a limited moment where actually the hardcore strategy people were willing to really think about human rights because they thought the game was over for anything with the current regime. So that's a pragmatic way about thinking, when is the moment that you're willing to really take ethical human rights conversations and put them right on the table and push hard with a sitting authoritarian, a dictator. The other framework, though, that really is out there and I think is dominating conversation, and maybe it's a little bit controversial to say, but maybe rightly or wrongly, is really the international legal. And what's interesting about you, to me, is that you're not a lawyer,
right?
Unless I've missed something.
No.
And most people that get the platform right now on questions of ethics when it comes to negotiations are actually lawyers. And so that the obvious thing that's been taken off the table when it comes to trade rights are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, because they're not things that you're allowed to bargain with. The Europeans puzzled way.
No.
It's not only about the International Criminal Court, but it's about legality. So when you think about what is the framework for deciding whether something's on the table or off the table? Can you negotiate it away or not? Is it, is your framework, and maybe this takes us into the Russia-Ukraine question, is your framework determined by what role does law play? And what role does, just pure pragmatism, what's possible, right? The sort of North Korea example. Is it about, the lawyers say we now can't, and it's very unclear what we can talk about Putin with now, if that was even where we were, which we're not, as the ICC. But is that a legal question, or is that a pragmatic question, or are these things just simply completely integrated in a way that nobody's quite clear about?
No, so anyway, I think that my own view of pragmatism is that it has a moral component within it. I don't think you just give it up. So it's very interesting the way you said that. I don't think even in a negotiation, if you say you sort of, give it away, if you will, I don't think you ever give it away. I mean, I think that, if a compromise is made, it's still there, right? It's still part of an overall. And again, decision-making is an iterative process. And so while a decision might be made that might be suboptimal or considered, people would be offended that you put this to the side in this instance. Well, it's not over. It remains there. It remains part of the story. And I do think it's the role of leaders to bear that in mind. In other words, yes, there are decision points, but I think my own view of ethics is that we make decisions, but then other decisions come. So in other words, if you put human rights to the side for the sake of X, Y, or Z, it remains there. It doesn't go away. And I also think this notion of pragmatism. Again, this is sort of a long-term, short-term idea. What works? Well, again, it works maybe for now, but my own view, if you're really following from an ethical perspective, a pragmatic approach, there has to be moral dimension in there somewhere. Or whatever it is that you've accomplished, you think you've accomplished, is not likely to be sustainable in some way. That at some point, again, power, there's going to be a countervailing, reaction to whatever. If you've done something truly immoral or amoral on the basis of power politics, there's going to be a power reaction to that. So in some ways, what I'm trying to do is expand that decision. So then we can, So Korea, the Korean thing is really interesting. Besides maybe obvious whatever, but one of my concerns when not sure if this was a time frame you were talking about, but when President Trump was going to meet with him, I thought he was providing a legitimating function without getting anything in return, from a human. The one thing, you could make a rational argument for, we have to change the game, we've got to do something radical, something, big, fine, or whatever. But there was absolutely no exchange there in terms of raising him up to some level without getting anything back.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And the time frame, and I'm going to open it up because I think there's I completely agree with your framework. The problem is not with the framework, but actually when you get to the concrete cases, the challenges are really difficult. And for my part, I don't think the legal answers are actually unsatisfying because there are sequencing issues, there are 2 tracks issues, there are really tough issues, and there will be tough issues to deal with. The moment when there were a lot of people on the nuclear strategy side, at least the ones who I were talking to, that were saying, okay, fine, we'll talk about human rights because nothing else is working, it was pre-Trump. Right, it was pre-Trump. It was around the time when Richard Hawes wrote his piece in, I think, the New York Times or the Post, saying we need to go for regime change. That was quite a big comment. Where people were just saying nothing is working. The 6-party talks aren't working. Bilateral talks won't work. Nothing will work. So why not hammer them on all fronts and assume that this regime has to go? And then, of course, Trump put us in a different moment. And you're right. He just gave it away. Lots of these questions came up over Bosnia. This is none of these discussions are new, but the context has changed. I'm going to come right to Professor McCox because I think
thank you, Joel, for your insightful comments. And at this stage, you always ask the question, what would Hans have said?
Yes, of course.
That's for an older generation, possibly. But can I take you back historically to a book which I've written about too much, international relations theory that I've got confused with quite often. His name is E.H. Carr. And Carr wrote, as many people around this table know, a great book in 1939 called The 20 Years Crisis, which by far and away the most influential book ever written by a British high-order. Great colleagues at the LSE, but I think Carr is the most quoted still, and the book is still. And it's an interesting book in terms of the questions you raise, I think, about the ethics and realism. I always ask myself, because really in the end, what Carr is arguing for is appeasement. That's the practical consequence of his theory of peaceful change. He wants appeasement of Nazi Germany. And we know what subsequently happened, Munich Agreement. I can't put it all down to Carr, but there you go. And I always, though you might want to, I don't know. I think Chamberlain had something to do with it too. But I asked myself, was that an ethical position he took or a realist position he took? Because from an ethical position, you could defend Carr and say his principal goal was to prevent a war, which is a highly ethical thing to want to do, prevent millions of people dying in a conflict. In other words, it's an order principle, and order itself is an ethical is an ethical position to take. On the other hand, you could argue, well, damn realist card just wanted to hand small nations over to large countries, in some ways, So I know it's an historical one, but it seems to me the car in the 20 years crisis. And Morgenthau, of course, picks Carr up later on, as you know, and criticizes him, I think, fairly and unfairly. So I just want to see, so that raises to me really that question you raised. How do we know if it was an ethical position or a realist position, or whether or not they were one and the same thing? Because later on, of course, Carr was slammed, at least in politics, for arguing for something called appeasement, when Carr said, well, what's your alternative? Because the only alternative to appeasing a dictatorship was going to be war. And he thought that was a very ethical, moral position to take, as well as being a realist one.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, I'll give you my view, but just to finish, Marguerite brings this up in the book, right? So this is the classic case of Munich and appeasement. In fact, it's interesting how appeasement, even the word now.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, whatever, it's how it, what it means. It should not necessarily mean what it, we all have these negative connotations in it. Not necessarily should have that. But anyway, the point that Marguerite makes is that the mistake that what makes Munich a rotten compromise is that it's a compromise with radical evil. That it might have been a political miscalculation. Okay, those things happen, but that the nature of Hitler, the nature of the regime, that it was a radically evil. And then what do we mean by radically evil? That it was, by design, inhumane and cruel, right? So, to the level that what's noble, we can argue about what's noble in 1938, so on, but it's something worth thinking about, right? So that it is in the rotten compromise bucket, it's the compromise with radical evil going to some degree of giving inhumanity at a systemic level, right? Is the place where that line would be drawn. Yeah, and this is the world we live in today. It's still the reference point. 1938, still the reference point. And so those are decisions that policymakers will need to make today. Right? Putin indicted war criminals. Is that regime? Is it radical evil? And we can just
my quick comeback on that. I'm becoming very quick. Is did it work?
Right.
That's the question. Not was it evil, but did it work? And probably failed. But in other cases, it might. But anyways, I'll leave that.
I'm not going to have to respond yet because I've got Jamie and then Dana, and I'm sure there are others on the table, but Jamie.
Leslie, as always, Leslie, thanks for the invitation today. Thank you very much for coming. Jamie Shea, I'm an associate fellow here. I'm more news-oriented, if you'll allow me. But Leslie picked up on this already. If you look at the invasion of Ukraine, which of course has dominated our thinking over the last year, on the one hand, deep grounds of pessimism. So many international rules being violated. We all know them, not just in terms of war crimes, environmental damage, kidnapping of children, targeting of civilians, on it all goes. So on the one hand, you could be sort of deeply pessimistic. The whole edifice of ethical standards and norms fragmenting in the white versus right syndrome. On the other hand, you could think maybe something positive would come out of this in the way that the international community now is sort of coming together to collect evidence, thinking about a tribunal for the crime of aggression, the indictment of Putin already mentioned, and so on. So in judging this, which side of the ledger do you come down on? The more this is terrible, and how could we possibly fix all of this, or this is nonetheless coming out of the Ukraine conflict, an opportunity to move forward. What factors would influence your thinking? And Leslie, if you give me another thing, but the coincidence of today, the alliance of democracies holding its second major summit, hosted by Biden, with 120 odd governments, I understand, signing up. Clearly, is this, from your point of view, because it's a US-led initiative, something which is useful in terms of helping to create a more steadfast or normative order, push back against the authoritarians, or is it something which can make the democracies feel good about themselves, but ultimately won't have that kind of leverage effect? So indulge me, please, with those two questions. Thanks.
Wow, those were great. I was anticipating the second
I've never claimed originality.
We'll get to that. my position is always somewhat mixed. I sort of have the sort of Reinhold Niebuhr was known as he was an optimistic pessimist, right? Something like that, right? I mean, it's always going to be mixed. But you're asking a direct question about this moment, and I'm actually more on the pessimism side. I appreciate what you say about a group of nations standing on principle for a set of values around what's happening in Ukraine, and that's clearly a positive moment and a necessary moment. But I will tell you that I just by chance happened to be at the United Nations on other business, but it was the day the General Assembly met last month, 2 months ago, on the resolution. It was a General Assembly resolution on condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. And as you may know, I think there were 41 countries, which account for 2/3 of the world population, who voted either against or to abstain. And you can't make this up. I was actually, the panel I was on, the Indian ambassador was sitting to my right, and the ambassador from South Africa was sitting to my left. And these two women left during the course of the conversation to cast their vote. And to add irony to this even more, the occasion that I was at, we were meeting in the ECOSOC chamber. They ran over to the county. We were talking about the legacy of Gandhi 75 years ago. So we could extend that conversation later, but it was really quite a moment. But it was a moment that I probably needed to experience personally to think about how this is actually, what's happening right now. I think it's something that probably hasn't registered in the United States as much as it should. That the BRICS countries, Global South, and others are not necessarily with us in our stand, particularly on Ukraine. It was sort of an eye-opener for me. Now, whether that's on the merits of the case or whether that's on, it's time to, it's sort of counterbalance. We're talking to the Americans and the Europeans calling them shots. I don't know. You can sort that out. But I think that's a really important part of the moment that we're in, that particularly when it comes to India, in these other big countries in the global south, that I don't know. It's, again, some of it's just kind of politics, but it goes to the value proposition that I'm talking about. And maybe we can come back to this, but the one question I wanted to share with this group, right, the Biden position, that what distinguishes this moment is democracies versus autocracies. So to make it clear, I'm going to take that position, right, that that's where we are right now. Open societies versus closed societies. Plural societies versus ethno-nationalist societies. And you go right down the list, open economies versus state-controlled, theocracies versus open religion, right? So again, I'm saying this as a realist, but I think from a values point of view, there's a lot at stake right now. And I think, US and Europe, we need to have eyes open in terms of how the rest of the world is fielding that.
Did you want to say more about the Democracy Summit, or?
Maybe we can come back.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Very good. So much to say about that, but I'm going to resist. Dana Allen.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Dana Allen from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which, sort of sounds like a completely value-free zone. And to a certain extent it is. I would put myself at kind of the wet end of sort of my colleagues there. However, I have two sort of very quick cultural thoughts, and they're kind of strategic studies cultural thoughts. I mean, one is that I also teach at SAIS in Bologna. And I mean, I gotta say that I see an evolution of the curriculum and of students' interests, an evolution of the curriculum that I think is driven by the market, the student market, very much in the direction, Leslie used the word, not me, in the do-gooder direction, right? Everything And sometimes I'm confronting my students. And it seems to me all they're interested in is what is right, without even the rudiments of a strategy for how to get there. I mean, this strikes me as a problem. And the strategy is presumably going to involve the manipulation or the use of power in some way. So, I really, maybe, I'm getting somewhat older, maybe I have a nostalgic view of what we were taught when I went to SAIS in the 1980s, but I have some concern about that. And then, staying on the subject of culture, just from a podcast I was listening to last night, which was Ezra Klein interviewing somebody at Vox about this frightening acceleration of artificial intelligence. And one thing they were talking about towards the end was also sort of cultural silos that aren't able to, one cultural silo was, Silicon Valley people who, can see bad things coming, but don't really have a political sense of how you would, try to use politics and international governance and everything else to try to prevent bad things from coming. And then as they both said, the sort of clincher at the end is, well, even if you could restrain competing companies in Silicon Valley to try to slow down or something about this, there's a geopolitical problem, which is China. And I was really admired what this woman said, which was, it's ridiculous. We've had deals throughout our history in very dangerous situations. The idea that you couldn't, obviously it's difficult, obviously it might not work, but the idea that you couldn't get together with China and look at what's potentially, if not to human society, to human beings, a grave threat, and erect agreed guardrails just seems ridiculous. But again, this seems like a cultural problem, that you're not putting these things together. You're not putting ethics and politics and strategy together. Question mark.
Yeah, no, just quickly, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do at Carnegie Council, right? Again, just in simple philosophy, connecting ends and means in some way, right? That and to do it in an explicit way, in a reflective way. I was thinking about our theme today, engaging with authoritarians, and if Munich is the case of appeasement, well, engaging with authoritarians, World War II is, the Allies, we allied with Stalin, right? And that should be, how do you have to reconcile that? Well, how did you reconcile that? Well, this was an end to means question. My own sense is that Roosevelt understood at a deep level, actually, what he was doing and what was being done. Churchill talked about that. But so anyway, I'm just sort of ratifying your position, which is I think there needs to be, from a strategic studies point of view, a kind of a deeper understanding of how these trade-offs work, how do we think about it in an iterative way. And again, it's just making the point again that we're not, it's not two separate realms. It's something that should be seen together.
I will just add one comment before I come to Sir John, which is that the law has also affected this, because the law has developed and changed in a way that sometimes makes us feel like deals are hard, and it's very ambiguous. Mm-hmm. Certainly, on the many of the questions that the ICC indictments throw up. Yes, once again, can you talk? Can you not talk? Can you travel? Can you not? All these sorts of things are unclear. But I think that the development of the law in the post-Cold War years certainly had an influence on students who are, in one bucket maybe more than another. There's also an age opposition issues.
one other idea.
No, not yours. Theirs.
That's just one other idea I want to throw out. Old fella. One other idea that I just think is really important. We didn't talk about this, but if we're going to talk ends and means, there's multiple ends. It's multiple goods. So, particularly when we're talking about security, peace and justice, and they don't. We're going to talk about this tonight, I think, at our dinner, but they don't always sync up, right? And so this idea of having trade-offs is the way we think about how we make decisions, and to be explicit about it. those trade-offs, I think is really critical.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks for inviting me along today. I spent my life as a practitioner.
Yes.
And most of my time in diplomacy and intelligence has been dealing with authoritarians, because they're the ones that cause the trouble. And if you try to manage security, you have to deal with them. South Africa is a classic case of how an authoritarian regime was persuaded and negotiated into a different approach. But then Jamie and I were involved in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and its breakup, where towards the end, and Milosevic was indicted in early '99, I think it was, whilst the Kosovo war was underway, we carried on dealing with Milosevic for another year, whilst he remained in power before we managed to get him transferred to The Hague. And that was a year in which we managed to achieve our strategic goals in Kosovo and actually create a change of government in Belgrade at the same time as managing Milosevic. And I'm not saying this is a managing Serbia. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a blueprint for how we deal with Putin at the moment, but the indictment needn't necessarily be an obstacle to dealing with a leader. I remember having a meeting with President Bashir of Sudan. I was leading a Security Council delegation to them on the eve of his indictment, and we knew and he knew that he was going to be indicted the following day, but we still had to deal with him because of the Darfur war that was raging, and which was the source of his indictment. You can manage the security issues and you can achieve your strategic goals whilst putting to one side for a period the legal requirements. I don't think that's an unethical thing to do. I think what we achieved in Kosovo, in some ways, it was a classic war of ethics. It was an ethical war to go to the conflict in the first place. But you have to have the capacity to see it through, and a strategy that enables you to circumvent, get round the obstacle that you're dealing with an authoritarian leader. So I'm just interested in your reflections on the Milosevic case and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and whether it has reflections there. Just one other comment. I'm always interested how clear-cut Americans are about appeasement. There's a bit of a review of that history going on here, simply because Britain was in such a weak state in 1938. We had no capacity whatsoever to wage war against Germany. Then we weren't in that much better shape a year later, but we were putting 30% of our GDP into defense. And it's striking that President Roosevelt, he wrote a two-word telegram to Chamberlain after Munich, which was "good man." Good man. Good man. Good man. Well done. And strong support from Roosevelt at the time. There's a wonderful clarity of distance that American academics have on that issue. But I just leave that to one side. I'd just like you to reflect a bit more on the Milosevic case as a scenario, as how we managed to navigate it.
Right. No, I thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think that's sort of almost a paradigmatic case of having to work through in real time, engaging with authoritarians but again, there was the sense of, I guess I have sort of a question back to you in terms of, though, in what sense was there clarity about the end state of what was to happen in that area? I mean, so obviously to get Milosevic out, but the way, I mean, then Holbrooke, I'm not sure exactly which time frame you're dealing with. You're talking about the Dayton Accords.
No, we're post-Dayton. We're
talking about later.
I mean, the International Criminal Court.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Set up in 1999.
No,
it was set up before then, I think.
Well, he was indicted
in Milosevic, but it was mainly aimed at the war criminals in Bosnia. And Milosevic wasn't indicted for any crimes in Bosnia. That was Mladic and
right.
Milosevic was indicted for crimes in Kosovo.
Right. And that was seen as counterproductive to what you were trying to do.
No, I'm not saying it was counterproductive at the time. In a sense, it was a bit of an obstacle for dealing with Milosevic, but we still, didn't stop Dick Holbrooke dealing with him, and quite rightly so.
Right.
because it brought an end to the war on grounds that we could sustain and defend.
Right.
And I think at some point on Ukraine, somebody somewhere is going to have to deal with Putin unless the Russian elite deal with him in their own particular way. But if he is still in power in Moscow, the end game of the Ukraine war will involve people dealing with Putin. But that doesn't mean we have to withdraw the indictment, even if he demands that we should withdraw the indictment.
Right.
So it's a question of the practicality of managing your strategic goals without compromising an ethical position. I think Milosevic is probably the best example of how we managed to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a great, you should write that up.
I'll add one brief anecdote and then come to Malcolm.
Yeah.
I was doing my PhD research at the time and was in Washington, and the story I was told was that Carla Del Ponte, who was the ICC prosecutor at the time, went around to all the capitals in NATO and she said, "I'm going to do this." And they're bombing her. "I'm going to do this." And they all went, "Don't do that." And then she said, "Would you like to go on the record?" Telling an independent prosecutor not to prosecute a sitting war criminal in the midst. And so they just went. But it is rapidly evolving. And if you think 1999 to where we are now, it's still not clear what you do about these questions. I'm sure people are going to have to talk, but are they going to go to Moscow to do it now?
Sure, they're not going to talk to anywhere else because he's not going to go anywhere else.
I mean, but he's not going to come
to
out.
London.
He's not going to come and talk to anybody now, right? Because he's going to be worried about and never mind the US not being in the ICC and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Hypocrisy, which is what India and South Africa, I'm sure, were saying.
Yes.
And please introduce yourself, even.
Malcolm Shammers from the Royal United Services in London. And I've been struggling with a lot of these issues for the last 20 years in relation to UK action. And I'd be really interested in your reflections as to what you've learned in relation to the whole series of interventions which both our countries have been involved in, many of which have not been crowned with success. And many of which we're justified by, and indeed often we're driven by ethical considerations. So, and specifically a desire to change the politics of other countries for the better, for regime change, for democratization in Afghanistan, Iraq, all the enthusiasm about the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. So I'd be interested in your reflections on that and how far you see the ethics being primarily an ethics of consequentialism, of a calculation of likely consequences rather than basic principles. And maybe linked to that, and it sort of links to your point about the Unger votes, as well as values in relation to political freedom and in terms of order or war prevention, which Mick talked about. There are also values of development, human development. And there are authoritarian governments in the world today who have achieved a lot in terms of human development and human security, even though they show no signs of democratization. There are quite a number of countries which have a great apparatus of contested elections, whose people live in dire poverty with low life expectancy and so on. So the correlation is not exact. And I think part of that division in Unger, which is not only about this issue, it's about a whole range of issues, is maybe that the global South tends, terrible generalization, I know, but most of the countries in the global South see the biggest gain post-1945 settlement to be self-determination and decolonization, while we, looking at 1945, because democracy was so central to our liberation in Europe, tend to see the main gain of 1945 as a triumph of democracy against authoritarianism. We're still using these two lenses to look at the international order. But in a world in which we are getting a bit less powerful in the United States in relative terms, as the West collectively, in the long term, is becoming less powerful, don't we have to make more accommodation in our ethical framework to the prioritization of development on the one hand and the prioritization of self-determination on the other?
Great question, but I will just revert to just your thing about the our last period of spreading democracy or according to some set of values. Going back to our friend Hans Morgenthau, his first rule of diplomacy was, should be divested from the crusading spirit, right? This idea of universalizing, like that's principle one. And if I had a self-critique from an ethics and international affairs perspective, I'll put it on the Americans from the last, so say 9/11 to this period. That would be my short answer was we did not read that principle. And we've suffered terribly from that. In addition to the second principle, by the way, which is that commitments should be made, right, in commensurate with power available to meet those commitments, right? And so, principle number two, we messed that one up, I think, as well. So that's my sort of quick answer to that. I do want to come back, though, and this is maybe it goes back to the summit of democracies and so on. And this is the question that with those principles asserted again today. This idea of thinking about what President Biden is saying, that we're in a moment of open societies versus closed societies, democracies versus autocracies. I'm trying to figure out myself really what to make of it. I'll just share with you. I had an encounter with a group about this size a couple of weeks ago from let's just say a closed society to remain nameless, and they were basically just sort of making a version of this argument that our society, we're a closed society relatively in terms of from a political science perspective, right? If you look at the different institutions. But the point they were making, well, the king builds good roads and, we can get to the airport and, our leaders are benevolent and, our people are doing well. And, and by the way, we don't really understand, your society when it comes to gender issues, family issues, these sorts of things and whatever. So, but this is again, how do we kind of sort that out? Again, this group was, claiming to be satisfied living in their sort of relatively autocratic society because it was producing. I will say, as a caveat, that these were people at the top of the society. These were the people who came to New York to talk to somebody like me. So, my sense is that it's like 90+%. I'd like to have a poll of others in that society and see what they think. But anyway, no perfect answer to that. But I think you're on the right themes there, and those things need to be worked out. I will confess, we're dealing with people who actually execute policy, right? So I'm just here making comments, but I do wonder what I would say to President Biden if I had my 30 seconds with him about the summit of democracy. I was hoping you guys could help me out in the sense of, just mixed feelings about, because at one level, when you put it that way, it sort of goes to violating that first principle. Again, if you're not careful, we're universalizing, we have to sort of, on the other hand, I do think that there are values that are at stake at the global level right now. And we have two systems, at least, especially as Russia and China are getting together. And, we didn't even talk about new technologies and so on. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I didn't come with an answer. I just came with a strong set of questions around.
We've got Anthony, Nikki, and Hugh. And please introduce yourself.
Anthony Dworkin with European Council on Foreign Relations. So actually, Malcolm asked the questions that I was going to ask, so I'll just rephrase a little bit the engagement question. Because, in a way, we've been talking about engaging with indicted war criminals, which is sort of at the extreme end of the spectrum. But if you're just talking about, authoritarian leaders, and obviously China is kind of a big question, but Iran, Saudi Arabia, whatever, not actually indicted. What are the how do you see the ethics working out? Like, what would be is kind of any engagement a compromise? Should our aim be ultimately to try and change their system? Should it be in some way just to kind of put on record that we don't agree with their system? Should we be kind of using sanctions? If we're not, and we have interests. I think your kind of short-term, long-term, framing is very convincing, but often, the kind of the long-term ability to influence the society is very unclear, and the short-term kind of grounds for some sort of interaction are quite strong. So, in the European context, one issue of the country that I do a lot is Egypt. Egypt, very authoritarian now. Very hard to see how European countries can really kind of shift the dial in terms of what's happening in Egypt, maybe on one or two specific cases. Does that mean, like, how should we then factor in our concern with the ethics, short of just kind of not engaging, which just seems to be shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, great question. I think anyway, the short answer is it's contextual and it's, and it's exchange. So what is the exchange, and having some consequential, view of that, I think is fair game. The only other thing I would say to that is some of this also comes down to, and this is part of the context, but you, in other words, if you're an agent, an individual agent or acting on behalf of, what it says about you in terms of that exchange. I mean, so you become implicated in some way, and so I think there should be some reflection on that, and that goes to, I suppose, some notion of exchange. What are we getting out of this? I'll just give you just quickly in a very small way this notion of legitimizing, right? So, like if we at Carnegie Council, have an event and we have, somebody from an authoritarian regime or an authoritarian leader or whatever, that provides a legitimating function for that person. So, I would ask myself, what are we getting in return, in the sense of, well, maybe we are getting an important education experience. This person should be heard, should be understood, and that there's some kind of, exchange there, almost an economic exchange. I think all of that kind of thinking is not only in bounds, but good. I do think that when you get to the people you don't talk, I think about this a lot. Like, okay, I'm not going to talk to that person. I'm not going to do business with that person. To me, the only rationale I really come up with to get there is just, it's a reflection on me or I just can't cross that bridge for my own, because this is where I stand as a moral imperative. But again, it's so contextual because it depends on who you are, or if you're dealing on behalf of an institution, organization, state.
Just to make the obvious point, the Summit of Democracies has a very strong internal U.S. domestic point, which may be more salient than any good it does internationally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm saying we're contesting democracy at home, so.
Of course, yes.
So there's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah.
Where things are going domestically.
Yeah.
I'm going to call on three people together. And I just want to add one comment. So, the Carnegie question is obviously one that's very big for Chatham House too, because we certainly host many people who are tainted, including many from our democratic countries, which isn't to say it's all the same, but there's a whether and there's also a how, right? And it's very tricky when you're the host. And you can't be rude. You can't invite somebody and be rude to them, but you can't equally just give a platform. And so, who else do you put on? And I think, I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday. And I said, I guess the trick is, like, if you're the chair and you're the CEO and you're kind of the host, you're the party entertainer.
Right.
In a serious way, but you are the host. You have to be kind. And so maybe there should always be somebody else on the panel who then can ask the tough questions.
You can't read the indictment.
I mean, these are this is really difficult stuff. And and then there's also for us, there's what does it mean to be independent?
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean to be neutral, but it's all extremely complicated, but actually highly consequential, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And getting tougher. And there's the deplatforming question that's taken over across, the university sector. I have Nikki, and I'm going to have you all introduce yourselves, Hugh and Sam, and please say who you are. We're going to take you all three together and then come back.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm an Academy Fellow here. And my question is concerned about the development of new technologies. So basically, I just wonder how resilient or how sustainable our value like democratic value is in the face of rapid development of new technologies like generative AI and all that sort of technologies, both in authoritarian regime and like democracies. So how would, because a lot of the time we talk about international politics, but right now it feels like even in the Western democracy, there's a lot of talk about how AI's development is threatening like democracy. And now if we are dealing with like authoritarian regime like China, probably have not so kind of advanced development in some of those technologies. Like how do you deal with this situation, and how can we still like uphold the democratic values in intense rivalry?
Don't answer that yet.
I'm Hugh Sandeman from LSE Ideas, and like Malcolm, I've been puzzled for decades about this issue. Mainly in my case, because of 25 years work as an activist in Amnesty International. And it seems to me, Joel, I'd be really interested in your view about this, that when we talk about ethics, not enough goes on quizzing what that concept means. Ethics, elaborated ethics, is as old as the history of the state, perhaps 2,500 years. And most of the time, the education of people in ethics, the elaboration of theories of ethics and so on, has gone on inside the borders of what you might call communities of one kind or another. And then you get to the modern era where it just spills out. And the complexity arises, I think, perhaps for two reasons. One of them is that there's never enough query about what happens when the discourse that goes on ethically inside a community, whatever that might be, spills over its borders into somewhere else. The second issue, which is demonstrated by the growth of international institutions since the Second World War, is the very explicit notion that actually ethics doesn't have any borders at all, but it quite clearly still does. So you have an ideology of human rights, which asserts no borders, and you have the practice of ethics, age-old practice, which actually is entirely contextualizing the community. And it seems to me that we won't actually solve this problem until we spend more time, A, thinking about the border of ethics in our own community and elsewhere, and B, simplifying and making less puffed up the international dialogue about human rights, de-elaborating it, bringing it back to concepts of utterly basic freedom, which Imacha said perfectly answers this question about the road to the world. Bringing it back to a much more simple discourse and a much greater humility about what happens when you go from the border of your own, not universe, community, into the broader sphere.
Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Leslie. My name's Dr. Simon Boland. I'm an Academy Fellow here, mostly focusing on health diplomacy and public health, so coming from a slightly different angle. I also should add, I previously went to the University of Chicago, but Mearsheimer that didn't rub off on me too much. So I think the question focuses a bit more on Leslie's point about moving on to how, or at least sort of some of the dynamics of actual transaction. And really straightforwardly, because I think my question is, how do you avoid developing a sort of market of transactional compromise? How do you prevent through negotiation, where you're accepting negotiation with illiberal actors, how do you stop them from hardening their position? Because there's a big difference between a small fly in the ointment and a cockroach in the soup, but there's a lot of space in between, and they're going to want that to be as close to the cockroach as they can conceivably get away with. And so if you're accepting the stakes of conversation, how do you mitigate, maybe not avoid, but mitigate the hardening and the worsening of positionality before in advance of the negotiation, where you might start beginning to trade off some of these things?
Yeah, difficult.
Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just very briefly try to touch all three. So thank you for raising the issue of AI, new technologies, democratic values. I mean, this is the frontier. We'll have another session, I'm sure, to talk about all those issues. Very complicated, but it's where it's happening. we've done a lot of work at Carnegie Council to begin to develop this sort of an ungoverned space in some ways, much of what's happening in the digital world. That's why it's so important, because there's going to be a competition between commercial interests, political interests, and it's all happening right now, and the teams are forming up. And I'm not sure exactly, there will be some advocacy groups, but who's speaking for ethics and for democracy, it's not quite clear. But I just want to mention something that, a piece that was done at Carnegie Council, thanks to Kevin, our team, and Marisa. I want to thank you as well for helping with this. But there's a piece that's posted there by one of our fellows, Jean-Marie Gaheno, and he actually complicates this conversation. And Kevin, you'll help me. The piece is what democracy and autocracy is the wrong way to look at this. Right? It's the title is wrong. It's wrong. Democracy versus autocracy is wrong. And so, by the way, it makes me terrified because I believe that Jean-Marie is usually right about everything, and I've taken the opposite position for the purpose of this talk. But the reason he says is he's going to AI, and the reason he says the democracy autocracy distinction is wrong is for this reason, which is that that's the old game. There's a new game. So I'll just leave it at that. It's a great listen or read if you want to look at that on Carnegie website. And then the issue of the discourse and how we're thinking about the notion of human rights and some degree of ethics that resonates globally. I'll also mention another Carnegie Council project that resulted in a book by Michael Ignatius called The Ordinary Virtues. And Michael really, I think, was trying to answer your question, which is, he comes from a human rights background, a human rights perspective with some critique of it, but, kind of where are we now? And he actually, it's sort of a long trek he sort of lands on the language of virtue ethics is a way to think about if there is a global ethic or ethics. And he very eloquently in his way talks about the ordinary virtues. And I thought that's an extremely helpful way to think about it in a way that answers your question, to try to boil it down and distill it. You'll see in the book, though, he remains somewhat of a realist, and he really is taking a very perspective on what can actually be achieved, and that the danger of overreach might be more dangerous than perhaps underreach or whatever. And then finally, this last question is spot on and extremely difficult. And I do think that's the sort of the heart of the question of engaging with authoritarians. Like, how do you make sure you're not giving it away? Right? It goes back to the question. The only thing I can come back with in a short answer to this question to close the session is that always being mindful in some ways of your ends. Any engagement with an authoritarian or somebody who you disagree with on an ethical basis, has to be that exchange has to have at some degree the ends in mind. You could think of thousands of examples. I think we all negotiate that in some way on a personal level. Institutions and states have to do the same thing.
Really very challenging issues.
Yeah.
And this was tremendous in terms of setting this up and giving us quite a lot to reflect on, as well as some frameworks to grapple with. I'm not sure it's going to make the next several months easier, but it's certainly going to make it more fruitful and give us more sophistication in our approach to thinking about some really concrete hard challenges that ourselves and the people that we engage with are going to have to just deal with. So I'm looking forward to carrying on the conversation, and I hope our two institutes, the Council and Chatham House, and you've got all these other institutes in the room, will continue the conversation virtually, in person, in multiple ways. Thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you especially Joel and your team.
Thank you. Thank you all.